started. Hello, everyone. My name is Hester Sarabrin. I'm from Transportation Choices Coalition, and I'll be kicking off and moderating this panel. We are here today to talk about policing and enforcement in transportation. Can you see my slides okay? All right. Thank you, panelists. I am really excited for everyone that is attending. We have a really awesome panel. I'm going to do some quick introductions and then do a little context setting and then kick it off to them. I think we will be entertaining comments and questions in the chat, but I think majority of the idea is just to give you access to these great minds and have a chance to listen and hear what they have to say. So we've got Dara Baldwin, who's the Director of National Policy for the Center for Disability Rights. She works within the disability justice movement, centering Black, Indigenous, people of color, and with an intentional strategy to end racism and systems of oppression. We've also got Phyllis Porter. She's the co-chair of Whose Streets, Our Streets, and a transportation equity and communication consultant with GW Frost and Associates. Whose Streets, Our Streets was created as a majority BIPOC and BIPOC-led work group to review and recommend strategies to street use design, laws, and policies through a pro-equity and anti-racist framework. We've got Allison Schwartz, who works at the City of Seattle Department of Transportation, serving as a planner and strategic communications advisor. She works on Seattle's Vision Zero efforts and now leads the program. Nat Jacob is an attorney at Jefferson Associated Counsel in Jefferson County, where Washington, we're all except Dara based in Washington State, where he's working on a statewide effort to end debt-based driver's suspension. So you'll get to hear about all the work that each of these panelists is doing shortly. So I just want to again, ground us in some data and some context for policing and enforcement in transportation. You know, I shouldn't have to tell any of you this, but I'm still gonna go over it because I know that in a lot of these spaces, it's a majority white planners and people working in transportation, and I wanna make sure we're all kind of pointing in the same direction. So. There's a great quote that I like to share from Brenton Mock at City Lab, who said, "The Jane Jacobian idea of eyes on the street very easily becomes eyes on the Black people, which is why some African Americans disengage from public spaces like parks and streets altogether. These peaceful green spaces just as easily induce anxiety and trauma for Black and brown people, especially when they know that at any moment cops can be unleashed." So a lot of the data I'm going to share is Washington State specific, but I think it is almost without a doubt, you'll see the same disproportionalities in other states and nationally. I also want to acknowledge this week the race-based hate crimes against Asian American women. There's a really united theme of white supremacy and race-based violence, which is a reason many marginalized groups do not feel safe in transportation systems. So Black and Indigenous people suffer disproportionate police violence. Black, American Indian, and Alaskan Native community members are significantly more likely than white people to be killed by the police. Latino men are also more likely to be killed by police than white men. And for young men of color, police use of force is among the leading causes of death. Policing in transportation in particular leads to injury and death for Black and brown community members. Traffic stops are the most common interaction that people have with law enforcement. Policing and transportation provides opportunities for discriminatory targeting of civilians. Across all modes, locally and across the nation, jaywalking, failure to show proof of payment, broken taillights, and other minor traffic infractions have provided justification for police involvement that ended in civilian death. Even when a racially profiled traffic stop doesn't result in violence, stops create fear, humiliation, and PTSD. Policing and transportation leads to injury and death for Black and brown community members. Saeed Joaquin, Sandra Bland, Dijon Kizee, Byron Lee Williams, Samuel DuBose, and Oscar Perez Giron were all killed after being stopped for routine transport enforcement. Black and brown folks disproportionately receive transportation-related tickets. For walking, in Seattle, 28% of jaywalking citations in Seattle were to Black people, who represent just 7% of the city's population. While 9% of people who ride Sound Transit light rail and trains are Black, 22% of riders caught up in the fare enforcement system were Black. Black, Latino, Latinx, Native American, and Pacific Islander drivers in Washington were searched at a rate up to 5 times higher than white motorists. Black and Latinx drivers were issued 2.6 and 1.7 times more traffic infractions per capita than white drivers, respectively. Oops, I had those facts for you right there. Black, Indigenous, people of color are charged with more punitive fines, fees, and other consequences at a higher rate, causing economic and mobility impacts. So you can see some of these facts here. Transportation enforcement is expensive and punitive fines aren't working. For example, Sound Transit spends $1.4 million a year on fare enforcement, does not get money from the fines, which are handled by the court, and a majority of the tickets were unpaid and were sent to collections. I want to invite you all to listen to the lived expertise and other expertise of this panel. But I also want to invite you not just to listen and then think your job is done. So I've drawn this kind of janky chart to show about listening. You want to believe the BIPOC stories that you hear, and you not take up space in these areas. Don't compare your experience in enforcement and policing to those of Black, Indigenous, people of color. You need to validate and don't flood the room with your feelings. Instead, we want you to give money. We want to use and share your power and access. Do research, lift up others' work, give credit. Don't speak on behalf of BIPOC, but speak up on behalf of racial justice. Know that you'll mess up. Listen to feedback you get. Don't be offensive. Pivot your strategy, apologize, and move forward. Thank you. So now I'm going to hand things over to Phyllis, and I am going to share Phyllis's slides. So just a moment.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here today. I'm Phyllis Porter, co-chair of Whose Streets, Our Streets. And again, so excited to be a part of this panel for a much needed discussion. And also thank you, Urbanism Next, for inviting WSOS, Whose Streets, Our Streets, to help lead in the conversation of policing and enforcement in transportation. Next, please. Some of you here on the screen who are from Seattle may recall this, but for people who don't, it just represents, some people have different meaning when it comes to safety. Some people have different meaning when it comes to policing and of course enforcement. And of course, that's why we're here today. And the reason goes back, let's say for a century. We know that for a century, the laws and policies that governs our streets in Seattle and in the nation has been largely written, enforced, and adjudicated by white people and upholding a white supremacy racist system. And in return, there's been perpetuated violence. And also BIPOC individuals are being excluded from the full free use of public streets. Next. Next screen, please. So I want to tell you a little bit about who we are and what we're doing and why this effort is really important to us. The Whose Streets, Our Streets work group. We are comprised of a dynamic, diverse community of members with expertise in transportation, mobility justice, public health and safety, criminal justice, and public policy. We are a Seattle-based majority BIPOC work group. We're dedicated to reviewing and recommending changes to street use design, laws, and policies in order to better meet the needs and support the lives of all street users, especially the BIPOC community. Next slide, please. Our values, we sat down and we came up with values before we actually got into coming up with the recommendations. People first, place over space. We also believe there needs to be system changes over individual changes. And last, decriminalizing poverty. Next slide. As our journey started, it started in the wake of the George Floyd, everyone is familiar with what happened with that. So during the summer, last summer, we went through a process of centering our values. We used a pro-equity and anti-racist framework. to review the laws and policy governing the use of public streets. And by the end of the year, we had a vision and we had a set of recommendations on how streets in our community, within our city, and throughout the nation could be a safe, thriving place without the use of armed police officers. Next. Our recommendations are here. I'm going to start with each one, just if you could listen carefully. I have a link I'm going to put here in the chat box. Let me see if I can put, this goes to all panelists. I'm going to put it for everyone. Let's see, attendees, panelists and attendees. And if you like, you can open it up. It's pretty large. So I'm just going to go over the basics and maybe we might have time to do more. And I've lost myself from the screen. So just a second. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. Okay, first we will start off with the first recommendation, cease. Cease involvement of the police in traffic enforcement entirely. This includes officer patrols and stops for speeding and other traffic violations, as well as responses to crashes. That means you can go through and repeal laws restricting sworn police officers. Also establish a triage system through the 911 operators and make sure when an incident happens, you have the mental health staff, you have the medical staff, you have staff also who is trained in de-escalation. Prioritize. When seeking to reduce traffic violence, prioritize non-punitive methods for making streets safer. This includes harm reduction, driver's education, community service, and direct assistance, along with community building. Third, abolish. Abolish enforcement of activities and actions that don't harm other people and repeal laws that have shown little or no impact to public safety, but have resulted in unequal enforcement and opportunities to racially profile. And then the last one is invest. Invest in people and communities to foster ownership of public places. There needs to be trust, support, and invest in the owners and the experts of the individual communities. Again, if you had an opportunity to take a look at the list, you see that the list is pretty long, but I will give you some examples because we have had some movement. I can say, for example, at the state level, we are now having some partnering with other organizations on the fur enforcement to remove fur enforcement on transit. Also at the county level, we're working with our allies, other community ally groups on repealing the helmet law. I mean, organizations in Seattle like Seattle Neighborhood Greenways, Local Bike Group, Cascade Bicycle Club, and the list goes on. So in conclusion, to me, this is really exciting. We've had a great time working on this and we're really excited to see this continue to move forward. And so we just ask that everyone just please take a look, listen, and be ready to do your part to make the utilization of streets be open and equal to everyone involved. So I thank you. Next slide. Again, thank you. And the contact information is there, and also the link for, again, the link for the recommendations are there.
Thank you so much, Phyllis. We're going to hand it over to Dara.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Peace and blessings, everyone. Again, my name is Dara Baldwin, and I am here in Washington State, DC Statehood, DC Statehood, DC Statehood. I have to always say. And thank you, Hester. Thank you to Urbanism Next for having me here, and to my wonderful co-panelists. So, Phil, I'm going to pick up where my wonderful sister left off. I'm also the co-chair of the Transportation Equity Caucus. And I will put those links in the chat box when I stop talking about what we're doing and what's going on there. Phyllis touched on it a little bit, and the definition of safety, that is where we need to come from. And Hester, I thank you for your opening. It was wonderful. It was really grounding for us. I think we're all here to work together so that we can make sure everyone, right, thrives. not just survives and lives, but thrives, right? I tell people, and have fun in life, right? So let's do that, especially after all this pandemic, right? So safety, when people define safety, and specifically in urban development, in transportation. And I want us to have this holistic view. That is what the Transportation Equity Caucus does. The co-chairs is Policy Link and my organization, Center for Disability Rights. It's been around for about 10 years now. And we come from a holistic view, right? Taking this from housing, from public health, right? From which is a racist and ableist model, but okay, that's what we have right now. If you don't know public health is racist, look at what's happening with COVID, right? We take it from engineers, we're taking it from researchers, all those kinds of people on the Transportation Equity Caucus. So when you define safety, safety is defined through a white lens and through a white supremacist lens. And Phyllis touched on a little bit. We did a webinar on the history of law enforcement and transportation, and you can go to our website to see it. That was our part 1. Policing, if you don't know, in this country, is founded in slavery. It was slave patrols. They were men, white men, who went out to get the master's property, and they brought us, right? They brought the enslaved person back who ran away or whatever was happening. They were not only used for runaway slaves, but they were also used to, right, make sure the enslaved people were doing what they were supposed to do in the fields or in the house, by whipping them, by punishment. And that is where structural racism, what we talk about, happens. And what we find in transportation specifically is that you have this E, right? You have these 6 E's, right? And one is E of enforcement and bringing in law enforcement. And you constantly see white folks setting that up, that this is the way to resolve this problem. If people are speeding, then be punitive to them. Cause them harm and they'll do right. And that is not how this works. It does not work that way. We found that out as we talked about, not only through safety programs, but throughout this country. The war on drugs. Did it work? No, it did not. The war on poverty. Did it work? No, it did not. The war on all these things to classify things and put a foundation of threats and being punitive to people to get them to have the thriving life they need is wrong. We need to invest in people. We need to put money into people. We need to make sure that people have the systems that they need to thrive. And so what does that mean? That means that we need to invest in education and environment and housing and in transportation. And we haven't seen that over the years. And so that's why we have these problems. I also want to talk about automated enforcement and surveillance, putting up speed cameras, which most of the time, like here where I live in a district, and they are in the area where Black people live, which is southeast, northeast where I am. You will not see speed cameras in Georgetown where wealthy white folks live. You did not see any cameras around the Capitol. The reason what happened in the insurgents, and the FBI has to use all of these images from social media and from people holding their cameras in their hand, is because there are no cameras around the Capitol, because that's a wealthy area of DC. So they wouldn't put those speed cameras there. They put them in our neighborhoods to make Black people and Black and brown people act right, right? So that's where they are. It's also surveillance, right? It's the loss of people's First Amendment rights and how you're surveilling their bodies and what are you doing with that data and how is that data being used? And then finally, thank you, Hester, for putting up the names of people who have been killed based on traffic violations. NPR investigative reporter did a report a couple of weeks ago. It came out. It's her sample size, but many people have done these reports. And in it, Black and brown folks who were harmed by the police or killed by the police, 25% of the cases were traffic violations. And that has been shown over and over again. If you saw what happened to Mike Brown in Ferguson, and the reason Black Lives Matter jumped off, it was because Michael Ferguson was doing something in the street. He was a pedestrian. And then the consent decree that came out of Ferguson, you will see, they were ticketing the people in that neighborhood for small infractions and over again. And then they get sent, they couldn't pay the ticket. And you need to know all the things we fight for are connected. They couldn't pay for the ticket because we don't have time off, paid time off. So if you don't think your work is not about paid leave, it is, because it's about all those people having that. They didn't take the time off to fight the ticket if it wasn't their ticket. Then they didn't have the money to pay the bill. So then they come after them. They're driving, they got arrested, they go to jail. That's called bail. You see all these people who are in jail, they haven't been adjudicated, and they have a $50 fine, a $500 fine. They're in bail. That's what we call bail release and bail relief. That is what we've been doing. Now, if you're a mother or a parent and you've been in jail, you haven't been home, you lose your children, you lose your job. This is all connected, and we need to stop having enforcement be the solution. And programs like Vision Zero that are based in enforcement need to go away. You cannot do that to our people. It cannot be based on punitive systems. And the last thing I'll say is the solutions, as Hester said so well, must come from the people who are directly impacted by this, who have the lived experiences for this. And do not tell us this is the only way to do it, because that's the only way you know how to do this. That is the only way it has been ingrained and taught to you that the police will fix your problems, because most of those solutions come from white folks. That is not how we figure these things out. And it is the community who will figure it out. And there has been much been said that just like people who are in abusive relationships, you know you need to get out, but you don't know what's going to happen when you get out and where you're going to go. That is exactly what's happening here. We are in abusive relationships with law enforcement, and we may not have the solutions right now, but give us a chance and stop abusing us, and we will give you the solutions you need. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dara. Speaking of Vision Zero, I'd like to turn things over to Allison Schwartz.
Let me see if I have yet to master the screen share after 1 year. One second. Thank you so much, Dara and Phyllis and Nat and Hester, for pulling us all together, everybody for joining today to hear us. Good Lord, my husband even tutorialed me through this. Hang on.
At the bottom, you see a green box.
I see it, yeah. I'm trying to get.
Okay.
Almost there. Sorry, I have 2 monitors.
No worries, you're doing great.
All right, are people seeing Vision Zero Seattle?
Yes, there it is. Thank you.
And not my notes?
Not your notes.
Okay. Okay. It's great to be here with you all today. So I am the Vision Zero program coordinator out in Seattle, and here to talk to you about conversations that we're having at the city level within the Department of Transportation around Vision Zero and what safety means. So as a Department of Transportation, we don't oversee enforcement, but as Dara mentioned, we have come to rely on it without question. It is embedded into the approach that we've taken. So my presentation is going to focus on how we're rethinking that traditional approach to safety, to traffic safety, to center on racial equity. Here are some of the E's that Dara was pointing to. If you've been working in transportation safety, you know what the 3 E's are: engineering, education, and enforcement. These are things that we've long relied on. And at the same time, we've argued that our efforts are data-driven, which would maybe imply that we're using the most effective, proven approaches to move towards sustained behavior change. But we really haven't asked ourselves where that approach has gotten us. Not until recently, at least in Seattle. And in Seattle, not only do we have a Vision Zero goal, which is to end traffic deaths and serious injuries by 2030, but long before that, the city of Seattle instituted its Race and Social Justice Initiative with a goal to end institutionalized racism. So from where I sit as a public servant in Seattle working on Vision Zero, we're looking at each of these E's to better understand whether this approach is advancing not just our safety goals, but also our racial equity goals. So where has this gotten us? It has not gotten us closer to ending traffic deaths or serious injuries. So this graph is showing, back to 2010 up until now and looking into the future, how many lives have been lost and how many more will continue to be lost with the business as usual approach. We launched Vision Zero in 2015, and since then, more than 130 people have lost their lives in a traffic crash on Seattle streets. More than 1,000 serious injury crashes have occurred. We pan out to the national level, also not resulting in fewer traffic deaths. Has it gotten us closer to ending institutionalized racism? It's a clear and resounding no. Hester presented a bunch of information already. Dara showcased it as well, and Phyllis did too. And so here I am to show a few of the data points from Seattle specifically. Black people are more likely to be killed in a traffic crash. In Seattle, about 7% of our population identifies as Black, and 12% of our, they represent 12% of traffic fatalities. Not only are they more likely to be killed in traffic crash, Black people are more likely to be stopped and harmed by police in a traffic stop, and are much more likely to be ticketed, and ticketed at higher rates for things like driving without insurance or without a valid license. These are two things that are not top causes of fatal or serious injury crashes. Hester also pointed to this a bit. Black and Indigenous people in Seattle have been cited disproportionately for jaywalking and for not wearing a bike helmet. Again, these are behaviors that are just not primary causes of serious and fatal crashes. So where would we like to go? Where do we need to go? For the past several months, I've been working with colleagues across my department to start having some internal conversations around what community safety could be. We're in the early stages of these conversations, and we know that we cannot have them alone. You know, I've had some great conversations with Phyllis and folks at Whose Streets Our Streets lately, and I'm excited to, build partnerships with community organizations, with BIPOC-led organizations that are already working in this space and have been working in this space for a long time. So one thing that I'm trying to do is to create a learning space for my colleagues so that we can really have a shared understanding around how our existing practices and programs and past policies have led to where we are today. And we've also been inviting guests from our Seattle Municipal Court so we can learn about how the effects of relying on the criminal justice system do or don't actually support safe mobility. So looking forward, our goal is to center on advancing racial equity, to build it into all of our work. This is not just the work of my colleague who manages our equity program or my coworkers in the Equity Inclusion Office. This is everybody's work. So up here on this slide is a statement that we've developed at a staff level. We want to move away from the traditional 3 E's. We want to do more of what works to advance not just safety, but also equity, and do less of what doesn't advance those goals. So moving toward, emphasizing the street design that we know will change behavior for the better, eliminate the perceived need for policing in our work as a transportation agency, acknowledge bias, practice anti-racism, foster relationships with BIPOC and low-income communities as they have suffered violence and financial harm from existing practices. And with community, co-create structures that support healing, healthy, accessible neighborhoods in which BIPOC communities can thrive. For me personally, it has been a shift in thinking. What Dara said, that is what I was taught would work. So it's been, going from plugging along to believing in an approach because it's been the approach. Obviously, the more that I'm learning personally and the more shared learning that we're doing together as a team, as a department, the more we realize that things need to shift radically and that we have an obligation to be active participants in shifting it. So for anybody out there listening today who might be in a similar role to me, a city staff, or just a public servant, I just had a few notes here that I wanted to share. A lot of people, including people on this panel, have been working in this space for a long time, and some of us are new to this conversation. We're only beginning to understand and participate. Hester, I loved you called it janky, but I really liked your slide. And I feel like this echoes parts of that. We need to acknowledge past harms and our own missteps. And let's move forward in a different way. Let's be open to change and know that change takes time. In a lot of ways, people like myself need to step up, but we also need to step back. We need to shut up and listen, and we need to shift our structures and processes to support BIPOC voices. So thank you for listening to me. The contact info is here. Please reach out if you'd like to connect and talk more. I just think they're like anything else, there's such a good opportunity for shared lessons learned here. So I'm going to pass it over to Nat.
Thank you so much, Allison. Allison's doing a lot of great work thinking about possible policy solutions with community, and Nat is going to talk us through some specific legislation he's been working on.
Thank you so much, Hester, and thanks to the other panelists. This has, as Allison just pointed out, this has been a learning experience for myself as a white male, cis person who, has been involved in, I'm a public defender here in Jefferson County, Washington, grew up in a very white rural community in Montana. And, although I had parents who self-identified as free-thinking liberal people, we've been taught in our school system, a lot of things that are harmful, I think, in terms of how we approach the world as white people. And so these systems that are being discussed by Dara, by Phyllis, by Allison, by Hester, they reflect that. And that's something that I think is really important for us, particularly as I observe, or as I'm told, the audience is largely consisting of folks who design, are currently involved in planning and design and architecture and engineering and so on. And so I think it's really important that everyone hear that message. I'm here, as Hester pointed out, because I'm an activist for some current legislation in our state of Washington to end debt-based driving license suspensions. And this is an equity issue. For those who don't know what debt-based license suspensions are, they are most commonly moving violations that end up spiraling into criminal charges for folks who are poor, largely overrepresenting Black and brown communities, BIPOC communities, communities of color. Also, younger communities tend to be overrepresented in these crime statistics. And of course, the poor. I'm going to say something, and I'm going to repeat it a couple of times throughout my portion of this presentation because it's important. And that is, debt-based driving suspensions don't disproportionately affect the poor. They exclusively affect the poor because they criminalize conduct that has nothing to do with public safety and everything to do with a person's ability to pay. So commonly what will happen, and this is the status quo in our state, in Washington, is that a person will have some moving violation like a California stop or a speeding infraction. They'll get a citation from a law enforcement officer, and sometimes those citations come in the mail. As Dara was pointing out, sometimes you didn't even get pulled over. You just got caught on camera because your neighborhood is, has more cameras than the white neighborhood next door, or whatever the case may be. And you get the citation in the mail, but maybe you don't have the same mailing address because you're living in your car, or you've fallen on hard times, or you've moved, or what have you. Maybe you don't even find out about the citation. Doesn't matter, because if you fail to pay that citation or appear on that citation in our state, your license gets suspended automatically, just for one. Doesn't have to be a pattern or anything like that. And when that happens, the next time you get caught driving, whether you know or not that your license is suspended, you can be pulled over for having a suspended license, even if you are driving perfectly otherwise, and you can be arrested and jailed for that. It's called driving with license suspended in the third degree. And so I'm heavily involved in an effort spearheaded by the ACLU of Washington to end these debt-based driving license suspensions. There are national efforts that have been successful. There's, I believe, 17 states now that have ended this practice. And those states have done so in large part because there's an acknowledgement that this is, again, I'm going to just repeat this mantra here: debt-based driving suspensions don't disproportionately affect the poor. They exclusively affect the poor because they criminalize conduct that has nothing to do with public safety and everything to do with a person's ability to pay. Kind of cribbing off of some of the statistics and data that Allison mentioned in terms of, people of color being disproportionately represented in things like jaywalking citations and bicycle helmet citations. These are not things that have to do with public safety or harm to others in the community. And so they shouldn't be enforced to begin with, is my position. And when they are enforced, it's clear from the data that they're being enforced disproportionately against people of color, against younger people, and exclusively against the poor in the case of debt-based driving suspensions, just by its very definition. I want to share with you a couple of examples of that from the statistics gathered from a great study commissioned by the ACLU of Washington that came out in 2019. It covered a span of years dating between 1994 and 2015, and it found that first of all, at any given time, there are over 180,000 people in our state whose licenses are suspended for debt-based reasons. 180,000 is roughly 2.5% of our state's adult population. So if you think about 1 out of every 40 people in the state of Washington has their license suspended for failure to pay a ticket. It's a staggering statistic, and that's at any given time. It's a snapshot. The ACLU also predicts that since 1993, when this law was passed, $1.375 billion has been spent by the Washington taxpayer on enforcement of debt-based driving suspensions. Again, nothing to do with a person's, potential for harm to the community, everything to do with their ability to pay, okay? Or inability to pay in most cases. So those are a couple of statistics. As it relates to the present conversation, Black Washingtonians, who make up 4.1% of the state population, that study found that they're overrepresented. I'm sure that's unfortunately not a surprise to anyone who knows anything about overrepresentation of BIPOC communities in the criminal legal system at large. But in this case, they're represented by 12.4% of all of those cited for debt-based driving suspension crimes, which is more than 3 times the likelihood of a similarly situated white person. Age, this is even more staggering. The study found that fewer than 1% of all of those cited for debt-based driving suspensions were in the 60 to 89 age group. And that is, of course, a huge portion of Washington's population falls within the 60 to 89 age group. Fewer than 1% of them are cited with these types of crimes. And I think we know that that can generally be found to be a result of the fact that older people tend to have more wealth, thus tend to not be affected by these types of criminal charges or debt-based suspensions to begin with. So what can we do about it as a community? And specifically, what can you do about it as the audience to this presentation? Well, there are a couple of things. The first thing you can do is to educate yourself on the issue. And I'm going to drop a few links. My colleagues have been dropping some really helpful information into the chat to all of you. I'm going to continue that trend. The first thing I'm going to put in the chat is a great website from an organization called Free to Drive. It's a national organization. It has great infographics on the website and maps that show which states have banned debt-based driving suspensions and which states haven't. You'll notice that Washington is a little island in the corner of a bunch of states that have actually instituted these reforms over the past decade or so, and we have held ourselves out to not do that yet, which is something that we're working on currently in a legislative effort that could be going better for us right now. The second thing I'm going to put in the chat is the Driving for Opportunity Act website. It's a bipartisan bill that was introduced into the Senate, US Senate that is, in July of 2020. It's currently sitting in committee somewhere, but it was introduced by Delaware Democrat Senator Coons and Mississippi Republican Senator Wicker. There's some really great data on that bipartisan effort. And then the third thing I'm going to drop in there is Driven to Fail. That's the ACLU of Washington 2019 study that I've been referring to throughout my portion of the presentation. The second thing you can do to end this practice is to use your economic power and your voice to impact legislation. I'm just a shabby public defender, but I've become very much at the center of our Washington State's legislative effort, just by sheer, you know, setting aside time out of my otherwise busy schedule and like just going for it, you know, not because I had any sort of specific knowledge or expertise on the issue to begin with. And then the third thing that you can do is just remember your privilege and support efforts that end the enforcement and punitive-based models that Dara talked about of transportation reform, et cetera, and support things like bail relief, like Dara mentioned, and be bold in these, in your efforts. Don't kind of just pussyfoot around the issue. Support things like ceasing police involvement in traffic enforcement altogether, which is what Phyllis talked about. I mean, Dara made a really good point about how police departments came to be to begin with. Let's remember that these are glorified slave catchers that we're dealing with to this day. And so it's not a ridiculous concept when you frame it that way to get police out of the business of stopping people altogether, because we know that those stops lead to black and brown deaths. And then, you know, in the context of remembering your privilege, don't assume that cops need to be at the table until they are willing to acknowledge past harms and current and historic problems with policing and commit themselves to real reform. There's this tendency, I think, to just say, oh, let's bring cops into the conversation. Why? What have they done to address these harms? Nothing. All they've done is stand in the way, traditionally, of any sort of progressive reform that's actually going to help save people's lives and make our communities safer for everybody, not just for white people. So that's it. I'm going to drop these into the chat, like I said, but thank you so much for listening to me. And I hope I didn't go over time. I apologize if I did.
No, thank you, Nat, Dara, Phyllis, and Allison. I really appreciated everything that you have put out there and the resources that you've been sharing in the chat. We decided not really to have a formal Q&A with the audience, but I wanted to, the attendees are welcome to drop questions in the chat, but really I want to kind of foster a discussion amongst the panelists. And so I first want to just kind of open it up if any of the panelists wanted to say anything kind of responding or reflecting on what's been said so far. And then I have some additional questions I can throw out there.
No, this is Dara. I just want to say great panelists, and I love the conversation. And as you said, I put a lot of information in the chat box. And I would like people to take on the new 3 E's that we have in there, and, you know, around empathy and equity. Equity is fair and impartial. So I just wanted to say that, but looking forward to hearing your questions, Hester.
Any other reflections or responses?
I'm sorry, this is Dara again. And sorry, Nat, thank you for talking about law enforcement not being at the table. And we, you know, I also work in policing. There are some very liberal Black law enforcement groups who have taken this on and said, right, we need you to stop killing our people, and who have joined us in this fight to say a lot of the things that we want to change in the policing system, which, just so you know, in the Justice Policing Act that just passed in the House, does not do any of that. And I'll put our opposition letter to that bill. But they're saying that, as well as, right, progressive prosecutors, who many of them are my sorority sisters, many of them are Black women who decided to become prosecutors and decided to do things their way. Stephanie Morales is the first one in the country. She's in Fort Smith, Virginia. You should follow her on Instagram if you don't. I'll again put her name in there. But you have Kim in Chicago, and Rachel in Boston, Massachusetts, a couple of others around the country, who, if you know, prosecutors get to decide which cases they take and which cases they don't. And so they have decided, you shoot and kill a Black person, we're taking that case on. And Stephanie, that was in her first 6 weeks in office. It happened. They killed a young man, Black man, and she did that. So I just want to say that, right? So there are Black progressive law enforcement, and I would say BIPOC, there's some Latina, Latinx, Asian, who are saying this is wrong. And then the other side of it, as you said, it is not. You have a lot of police unions who don't agree with this. And the connection to transportation that you need to understand and know is all of the federal resolutions towards law enforcement are for local law enforcement only. That does not cover transit police officers. Most transit police and most transit work, traffic, transportation work that's done in this country is through federal funds. And so those are federal officers that are not being addressed in this work. And so we need to make sure that happens. And in any capacity you're in this work, you can do that. So that means, if you don't know, it's called the Bivens case, and we need a statute remedy for that. In the Bivens case, what it says was you could go after law enforcement in a certain way, but not federal. You can't touch federal, so you can't touch housing authority, police, transit, sheriffs. If you live in a rural area, it's gonna be a sheriff, a county, state police officers, all of the federal, FBI, CIA, DEA, AFT, and SROs, who school resource officers, and finally corrections officers. People who are in corrections facility, who are in the prison systems, are being killed by corrections officers. I mean, just listen to the list of names of law enforcement I just told you in this country. We don't have a list of that names of transit issues and concerns that will save us, but we got a laundry list of who law enforcement is to harm us.
Well, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to everybody that was on the panel and also the people that were attending. I think, Dara, you hit it on the nose. I mean, that's a long list of law enforcement, a long, long list. And that list has been here for so long. So it's great to see everyone on this panel who's working to diminish that list, diminish all these things that we talked about. And again, I just want to say thank you. I think it was very powerful today. And it like I said, a much, much needed conversation. Also, Allison, it's really great to see a city. I'm looking forward to working with you. It's great to see that ESTA, you know, the city has an interest in this. You've already started with reimagining streets. The conversation we've had over the last few months or so, this is what we need in every city. This is what we need in every state at the city municipality level. And again, I'm just, you know, it's just great to be able to talk about it and see right now, even though all this stuff happened, you have to go through the George Floyds, the Sandra Bland's, and so forth and so on. We cannot let their deaths go in vain. So just continue working, doing the great job that everybody's doing. And I'm looking forward to looking at all of those links that are in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Dara and Phyllis. I think we have a few more minutes, and so I want to use them if we have more to talk about. I think there's kind of two things I'm curious to talk about a bit more, and one is examples of models that work that you've seen in the States or elsewhere, and places we can look to. I think there was at least one example in the chat, and then knowing the scope and the focus of the Urbanism Next audience and kind of focus areas in particular. I think a lot of it is around kind of technology and new urbanism, and wondering what issues in particular come up in that kind of space that directly relate to this work. So if anyone has any thoughts, I'd love to hear them.
Do you mind repeating that once more? I'm sorry, I didn't get up with that.
Yeah, sorry. So the first is around models that work or change that's happening. You know, I think Dara put a link around something they're doing in Berkeley. I know, Dara, you've also talked about work in New Jersey around community safety. And then the other is around what issues in particular are coming up with kind of new urbanism and technology and shared new mobility that have to do with enforcement. And, you know, one example I've heard is that workers who are redistributing scooters often are workers of color who have to go after hours to get scooters off of private property and then have the cops called on them. So what other issues, I know helmet law, Phyllis, you mentioned, are particular to the kind of the new mobility and technology space? A lot of questions.
Well, I'll take real quick. So yes, you mentioned it. In Newark, New Jersey, which is my hometown, we have the Newark Community Street Teams, and they were started, again, right, a thought and idea about 20-something years ago. Unfortunately, Mayor Booker would not do this, and so we have Mayor Ross Baraka now, and he took it on. He created a public safety department, which is separate from the police department, and we have what's called Newark Community Street Teams, and they are a group of community people who live in the community. Newark is sectioned off of wards, right? So Ward 8, Ward 5. So you live in that section, you live in that area, you know the school, you know the neighborhood, you know the restaurants and businesses. And these are people, some of them are formerly incarcerated, who needed jobs, but they want to change their lives. Some of them, right, are as we call them, big mamas. They've been living in the community forever and have always ruled, right, ruled the area and said, you're not going to do this here. Some of them are youth, and they are set up to protect the neighborhood. They walk the neighborhood morning and night, while school was, actually Newark is opening schools back up, but before they walked in neighborhoods where there were gangs, and they would walk the children to school. And then, so, in the summer of 2020, Newark was a city just like all other cities. If you don't know the history of Newark, right, the riots of 69, we still got burnt out buildings from 69 in Newark. Anyway, they still protested. It is a very political city. There was not one arrest and not one rioting, not one building was destroyed or anything over the 6 to 8 weeks of protesting of Black Lives Matter in Newark, New Jersey. It was the only city in the country where that happened. And I'll put in the chat box, Laura Flanders show did a show on this, and we have the statistics and the data. This can be done. And the final one around transportation, there was an area in San Francisco, and it was a neighborhood in San Francisco, and they haven't written theirs up. I need them to write this up. But anyway, they had speeding happening. And on the street was the school and a kind of community center where seniors went. And so what they decided to do was that someone put the speed bump. Okay, that wasn't working because people just run over that. And then what they decided to do was use the community. And they asked the people who were unhoused, if you come here every day to the community center, we'll give you a yellow vest and a sign that says, please slow down. And they pay them $50. And you could come, you come when you want, because you don't force the unhoused to do the work. They said, fine, that was great. They held community meetings and talked to drivers and said, you need to know when you come through this neighborhood, this is who's crossing this street. Elderly and children trying to go to school and to this community center. And the community people, drivers were like, oh, we didn't know that. They passed out pamphlets because there was a light at the right. And when you stop, they said, here's this pamphlet. You need to know who's in this neighborhood. Please slow down. Please stop. Right. And those people went out in the rush hour, 8 o'clock in the morning, and the rush hour, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and stood with the signs and said, please slow down, please. So now you're giving jobs to people who are unhoused, right? You're creating a community for people who are there. And in that street, they said, it went down 90%. There were no more crashes. Nobody got hit by a car. The drivers even said, thank you. I didn't know this was a community. I didn't know I was doing this. And instead of being punitive to them, and explaining to them what was going on, because that is what is approaching something through love and care. If we loved each, all you need is love, right? That's what John said. All you need is love. The Beatles sung about it. If you love someone, you care for someone, they act better. They will create change within themselves, which then creates change within the world.
Yep, that's what's very good.
Any other final reflections? And also stop and give everyone a bio break between sections.
I also wanted to, a moment ago when I spoke, I also wanted to say thank you to Nat I think what he's doing, I think what he's doing being here today, just stepping up, as one of you guys says, step up and step back, you know, step up with your privilege, with your power and help, step back and listen. And I think what he's doing on his behalf of what he talked about today, I think that's really great. And one more thing, Dara was saying something about the community there in that town, how they had a group of people go out to certain areas and be there to help out with, you know, if there's any type of gang activity or anything like that. We have some of that same stuff right down in Rainier Beach, where they have, I think it's called passageways, where you have the African-American brothers come out during school time, you know, at lunchtime, and also at the end of the day, when schools are closing, you have like 3 or 4, you have an elementary, a high school, a junior high school, all right there in that vicinity of Rainier Beach. And where you have those people on the corner, those African-American men on the corner, to make sure there, you know, if there's any type of violence, we're not going to stand for it. If someone is being bullying, we're not going to stand for it. And I think if we can continue as a whole and look at just that small example there, the example there, we can continue throughout the city and even make it better. So just wanted to throw that in there.
Thank you, Phyllis.
Everybody's doing their part.
Well, thank you all, whole panelists, so much for your time and your expertise and your work in the community every day on these issues. I'm going to pop my email address into the chat, and if any of the attendees are interested or want to learn more about some of the groups or the work that these individuals and these groups are doing, please don't hesitate to reach out. And again, please, I urge you to take these conversations to all spaces, not just any, you know, not just equity discussions, not just enforcement discussions, but every single issue in transportation typically has a component like this, and it needs to be discussed in all places. So thank you for attending. Panelists, thank you again for your time.
Yay.
Thank you so much. I just want to
Thank you.
Be safe, everyone. Take care of yourselves.
I wanted to pop on and say thank you again to all these panelists for this fabulous session. And on behalf of Urbanism Next, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We have recorded these conversations and we will be making these public in a couple of weeks. So we do hope also that everybody who's participated and attendees who were here today will help us share these conversations broadly and widely in light of the conversations that we've just been having. So thank you again, and have a great afternoon, evening, weekend, wherever in the world you are.